quiet afternoon at a small diner until two police officers walked in. Amidst the crowd of patrons, they quickly took notice of an elderly black man sitting quietly in the corner. The man wasn't doing anything wrong, but his presence seemed to bother them. Snide remarks began to fly, and disdainful glances drifted towards the veteran's card he had placed on the table. Little did they know that in mere seconds, a truth would be revealed and leave them speechless. What happened that changed everything in an instant? Before we dive into the story, please let us know where you're watching from. Share your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow we'll bring you another inspiring story, tailor-made for you. The story begins. Jonathan Walker Jr. was a 75-year-old black veteran. Today, he sat quietly at a small table in the corner of a busy diner. Jonathan was dressed simply in a worn but clean jacket. His hands rested on a cup of coffee he'd ordered to pass the time. The diner's atmosphere was lively, filled with locals chatting about their meals and enjoying the afternoon. Jonathan's eyes occasionally glanced towards the door as he patiently waited for his son, who was running late. He had no idea that trouble and humiliation would walk through that door first. The diner's door swung open, and two police officers entered, Officer Johnson and Officer Smith. Their badges gleamed as they stepped inside, scanning for an empty table. Their eyes quickly settled on Henry, who remained seated alone in the corner. Daniels leaned towards Smith and whispered something with a smirk. The two officers chuckled. To them, Jonathan seemed out of place. The diner was located in a predominantly white neighborhood, and it wasn't often that they saw someone like Jonathan here, especially an older man. So, they decided to investigate and approach Jonathan's table without hesitation. Officer Johnson took the lead and asked Jonathan sternly what he was doing there. There was no greeting or courtesy, just a blunt and unwarranted demand for an explanation. Jonathan looked up from his coffee and calmly replied that he was waiting for someone. His voice was steady and didn't betray any of the unease he felt under their scrutiny. Officer Smith chimed in with a taunting tone, telling Jonathan that it was unusual to see a small, elderly black man trying to blend in with important people. As he said that, he chuckled as if he had just cracked a joke. Jonathan didn't react to the taunt. Instead, he maintained his composure as he reiterated that he was simply waiting for his son. But his calmness seemed to irritate the officers even more. Daniels was clearly not satisfied with Henry's answer. He leaned in closer and demanded to see Henry's identification. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Jonathan complied and reached into his pocket. He pulled out his veteran's card and handed it to him. He had carried it with him for years, and it was a symbol of his service and the sacrifices he had made for his country. But when Johnson looked at the card, he didn't see a veteran. Instead, he dismissed it with a contemptuous smirk and exclaimed that it was probably a fake. Johnson returned the card with a flick of his wrist, clearly not caring about the honor the card represented. Smith backed him up and remarked on how unbelievable it was that someone like Jonathan could have a veteran's card when, back in Henry's day, people like him were only washing dishes or doing menial jobs. These words were a clear attempt to belittle Jonathan's achievements and reduce him to a stereotype. Daniels laughed and nodded in agreement. Those were the good old days when people like Jonathan knew their place, as far as the police were concerned. Jonathan didn't belong in this part of town. Their tone made it clear that they considered Jonathan nothing more than an intruder. As the officers continued to harass Henry, the other patrons began to notice what was happening. Some glanced over with curiosity, while others listened with unease, but no one said anything. The diner's lively chatter died down, and the atmosphere grew tense, yet still no one intervened. But despite the humiliation he was subjected to, Jonathan remained composed. He had faced worse things in his life, and he wasn't going to let these young men shake his spirit. But the officers weren't done yet. Johnson told Jonathan that if he didn't leave the diner, they would force him to. They looked like they meant business, and they were willing to use force to back it up. Jonathan tried once more to explain that he was waiting for his son, but Johnson harshly interrupted him. He didn't want to hear it. To him, Jonathan was just a troublemaker who didn't belong there. The police were making it clear that they didn't want anyone like him around the diner. The confrontation had reached a boiling point. The officers stood over Jonathan, waiting for him to either leave quietly or give them an excuse to drag him out. But Jonathan didn't move. He looked at the officers with a steady gaze, his hands resting calmly on the table. The other patrons silently watched to see what would happen next. Jonathan knew that he was being humiliated for no reason other than the color of his skin. But he also knew that reacting with anger would only give the officers what they wanted and an excuse to assault him. So he remained silent, hoping that his son would arrive soon and put an end to this senseless confrontation. As the seconds ticked by, the officers grew increasingly impatient. They were used to their authority being unquestioned, and Jonathan's calm resistance and dignity were unnerving them. Daniels leaned in closer and told Jonathan that he had one last chance to leave the diner on his own. Jonathan didn't respond immediately. He simply took a sip of his coffee. And when he finally spoke, he told the officers that he wasn't causing any trouble. He was just a man waiting for his son. He had every right to be there just like anyone else in the diner. Daniels clearly hadn't expected this response, and so he was momentarily taken aback. The other customers in the diner were also silent, either afraid or indifferent to intervene. But there was no denying the tension that had gripped the diner. Jonathan knew that the situation was spiraling out of control, but he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not after everything he had been through in his life. He had faced discrimination and aggression before, but this was different. He had hoped that his service to the country would have earned him some respect, but it seemed that to these young officers, his history meant nothing. So, he sat there in a calm and dignified posture even as the officers loomed over him, waiting for the slightest excuse to act. Suddenly, Officer Johnson reached out and forcefully shoved Henry's chair, sending it crashing to the floor. The noise startled everyone in the diner, and all eyes turned to the scene. The veteran was forced to stand, but he maintained his composure. Johnson stepped closer, and without warning, he began to roughly search Jonathan's person, muttering that they needed to make sure Jonathan wasn't hiding anything. His tone implied that he was fully expecting to find something suspicious. Jonathan slightly raised his hands, not in surrender, but in compliance. They were the police, after all. He had been in situations like this before, where a calm demeanor was often the only thing that kept a bad situation from turning dangerous. Still, it was hard to ignore the anger simmering inside him. Jonathan had been a soldier, a man who had fought in wars and survived things these young officers could probably never imagine. And now, he was being treated like a criminal in his own country. Meanwhile, Officer Smith had picked up Jonathan's veteran's cap from the table. It was a simple cap, worn and faded with time, but it was a symbol of pride for Henry. Smith looked at it with disdain, then tossed it to the ground as if it were trash. He sneered that someone as washed up as Jonathan didn't deserve to wear it. For the first time, a flicker of anger crossed Henry's face, but he said nothing. He was determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose his cool. But the officers weren't done yet. Those in the diner were aghast, and some rose from their seats in shock. But still, no one intervened. The two cops clearly meant to go all the way. They were known in the area as bullies. Despite knowing that Jonathan wasn't reaching for anything dangerous, Johnson grabbed Jonathan's wrist and twisted it behind his back, causing the elderly man to wince in pain. The officers then mocked the pain Jonathan felt and joked that he wasn't as tough as he thought he was. Jonathan gritted his teeth but didn't cry out. He had endured worse pain in his life, both physical and emotional. But what hurt him the most was the disrespect he was being shown. After all he had sacrificed for the country. "You're going too far," Jonathan finally spoke up. "You haven't seen half the horrors I've been through. I deserve to be treated better than this." As Jonathan said these words, he wasn't trying to pick a fight with the police. All he wanted was for them to acknowledge that he deserved better treatment. But to the officers, it sounded like he was challenging their authority. "Is that so? You think you can tell us how to do our jobs? We'll show you who's in charge here. You'll be sleeping in a cell tonight for assaulting innocent police officers." Let's see who comes to bail out a nobody like you, Johnson sneered. Without wasting any time, he pulled out his handcuffs and roughly secured them around Henry's wrists. But they didn't stop there. Smith picked up Jonathan's cane and began examining it. It was an old, sturdy cane that Jonathan had relied on for years. Without a second thought, Smith did the unthinkable. He snapped it in half over his knee and then tossed the broken pieces aside. He turned to Jonathan and remarked that he wouldn't be needing it anymore since he'd soon be in a jail cell. The officers started to pull Jonathan towards the door, but before they could leave, Jonathan spoke again. He simply nodded towards the small card that was still lying on the table. Daniels, annoyed by the old man's defiance, snatched the card, fully expecting it to be something insignificant. But when he looked at the card, his face paled. The card was a simple place setting, something that wouldn't mean anything to anyone else. But on it, in bold letters, was printed the name Commissioner Walker Jr. The realization hit Johnson like a punch to the gut. The man they had been harassing, humiliating, and physically assaulting was the father of their boss, the police commissioner. All the arrogance drained from Johnson's face as he understood the gravity of their actions. Jonathan Walker Jr. had lived a long life, marked by service, sacrifice, and resilience. He was born in the South during a time when racial segregation and discrimination were rampant. Growing up, he quickly learned that the world wasn't kind to people who looked like him. But Jonathan was determined to make something of himself. When the Vietnam War broke out, he enlisted in the army, even though he knew that he would be fighting for a country that didn't consider him an equal. During the war, Jonathan saw things that no man should have to see. He lost friends, faced death, and fought with everything he had. His service was honorable, and he earned the respect of his fellow soldiers. But when he returned home, he found that the respect he had earned on the battlefield didn't translate to the civilian world. He was still just a black man in America, subject to the same prejudice and discrimination that he had known his whole life. Jonathan worked hard to build a life for himself after the war. He got married, raised a family, and was proud of the fact that his son, Robert Walker Jr., had risen through the ranks to become a police commissioner. It wasn't easy, and Jonathan faced countless challenges along the way, but he never let the world break him. He always stood tall even when others tried to push him down. Now, as he was being led away in handcuffs by two officers who didn't know who he was, Jonathan couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. He had fought for his country and risked his life for freedom, and yet now he was being treated like a criminal simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Officer Johnson was now fully aware of the mistake they had made. He looked at the place-setting card and noticed that his hands were shaking as he realized the gravity of what they had done. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a career-ending mistake. He released the old man's arms and started to stammer apologies. He tried to explain that they didn't know who Jonathan was, as if that justified their behavior. But Jonathan didn't respond. He just stood there waiting to see what would happen next. Officer Smith was also clearly shaken. The absolute certainty that had fueled their actions had vanished, and it was replaced by the cold reality of the consequences they were about to face. They had crossed a line from which they couldn't come back. The shame of their actions was evident on their faces as they stood there, unsure of what to do next. The other patrons, who were too scared to intervene earlier, now watched with a mix of relief and anticipation. Some even pulled out their phones to record what was happening as they sensed that this moment would not end well for the officers. But Jonathan remained calm. He didn't say a word as he watched the officers' expressions shift from arrogance to fear. He didn't need to. The name on the card said it all. The officers had humiliated a man who had served his country, a man who had raised a son to become one of the most powerful figures in law enforcement, and now they would have to face the consequences of their actions. Jonathan had been through enough in his life to know that things have a way of working themselves out, even if it's not always in the way you expect. He had faith in his son, and he knew that justice would be served one way or another. He knew that the officers would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Just then, the door of the diner swung open, and Commissioner Robert Walker Jr. stepped in. He was a tall, imposing man with a commanding presence that immediately drew attention. As soon as he walked in, the entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Commissioner Walker Jr. quickly scanned the room to assess the situation. He saw his father, Henry, sitting quietly at the table while two officers stood awkwardly beside him. Without a moment's hesitation, the commissioner strode over to his father's side. He knew what had happened even before he arrived at the diner. Someone had recognized Jonathan and called him. As Commissioner Walker Jr. approached the table, the eyes of the entire diner followed him. He first turned to his father, and his heart broke at what he saw. He could see the stains on Henry's clothes, the broken cane lying on the floor, and the handcuffs still around his wrists. Even so, the old man held his head high and looked at his son with pride. His expression remained calm and unwavering. The commissioner then turned to the two officers. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked them what they thought they were doing. Johnson and Smith, who had been so confident earlier, now stammered and their faces turned pale. They tried to explain, and their words jumbled together. They said that they didn't know Jonathan was, and that they didn't realize he was the commissioner's father. Their apologies sounded weak and full of excuses. But Commissioner Walker Jr. wasn't interested in their excuses. He looked at the two officers with a stern expression and told them that it didn't matter who his father was. Everyone deserved to be treated with respect, regardless of their background or identity. Jonathan was not only a citizen but also a veteran who had served his country with honor. Treating anyone, especially a veteran, with such contempt was unacceptable. Daniels and Smith listened to the commissioner's words, fully aware of the gravity of their mistake. They could feel the eyes of the entire diner on them, and the shame of what they had done was evident on their faces. Commissioner Walker Jr. didn't need to say anything more. His message was clear. Without any further delay, he ordered the two officers to leave the diner immediately. They were to report to his office first thing in the morning. There would be no further discussion or additional apologies. The consequences of their actions were unavoidable, and they knew it. Daniels and Smith lowered their heads in shame and left the diner in silence. After the officers had left, Commissioner Walker Jr. turned to his father. He reached out and gently took Jonathan's hand in his to unlock the handcuffs with a key he had in his pocket. As the metal cuffs fell away, Jonathan felt a sense of relief in his wrists from the release of the restraints. The commissioner then sat down opposite his father, and his expression softened as he looked at the man who had raised him. Commissioner Walker Jr. apologized for being late and, more importantly, for the way his officers had treated his father. He knew that no apology could erase the pain that had been caused, but he wanted his father to know that he would do everything in his power to make it right. Jonathan, however, wasn't interested in apologies. He looked at his son with pride and told him that he was proud of how he had handled the situation. His son had shown grace under pressure, and that was what truly mattered. The two men sat together in silence for a moment. Despite the pain and humiliation, there was a sense of peace between them. Jonathan knew that his son was a man of integrity, someone who would fight for what was right no matter the cost. And the commissioner knew that his father was a man of great strength and dignity, someone who had endured more than most people could imagine and had come out stronger on the other side. The incident didn't end when the officers left the diner. News of what had happened spread quickly throughout the town and beyond. The community was shocked and outraged by the officers' behavior, and many people spoke out in support of Jonathan and his family. The police department, under the leadership of Commissioner Walker Jr., launched an investigation into the incident. Johnson and Smith faced swift disciplinary action. They were suspended without pay for 6 months, and they were required to undergo mandatory training on issues of bias and respect. The incident at the diner served as a reminder to the community and the police force that prejudice had no place in their town. The commissioner's actions that day set a powerful example for his officers and the community, showing that justice and respect must always prevail. For Jonathan Walker Jr., that day was a painful reminder of the battles he had fought, both on the battlefield and at home. But it was also a day that reinforced his faith in his son and the values he had instilled in him. Despite the hardships, Jonathan knew that change was possible, and he was proud to have played a role in making that change a reality. What do you think about the punishment given to the two officers? Was it too light considering the humiliation they caused to an elderly veteran? Let us know in the comments below. This story is a powerful reminder that respect and compassion should always come first. If you were Henry, how would you have reacted in this situation? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story could inspire and create change. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of fairness and compassion. Thank you for watching and supporting. Continue to join us to discover more emotional and meaningful stories. Subscribe to the channel today so you don't miss the next stories. Wishing you peace and happiness. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to receive the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading human values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any errors, please ignore them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.